Erev Tov Rabotai. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Vav Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat Nereh Ben Tzvedlana Aranbai Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to define when in the 8th year you can assume that the vegetables being sold in the market are non-Shemitah produce. Me'ematai mutar adam likach yarag b'motzei Sheviit. From when after Shemitah is a person allowed to buy vegetables in the market and treat them as ordinary non-Shemitah produce? The Mishnah says, Mishiyaseh kayotze bo. From when it has reached the same level as that. What does this mean? From when the 8th year crop of that species has reached the same level of ripeness as the produce that is being sold on the market. Mainly to say that when the vegetables of the crop planted in the 8th year have become as ripe as those being sold, the buyer can assume that the vegetables on sale in the market grew and were picked in the 8th year, and they're not subject to the Shemitah restrictions. That is how the Rav explains it in his first explanation. Asa bakir utara afil. Furthermore, when the early ones become ripe, they permit the later ones. Meaning, if a species ripens early in one place, a person is allowed to buy that same type of produce even in a place where it ripens later, because we can assume that it came from the place where it ripens early. And the Rav explains, sometimes a species of vegetable ripens faster in one place than another. So the Mishnah is telling us, as soon as vegetables in one place have grown as ripe as those being sold, the buyer is allowed to buy this species anywhere, even in a place where it has not yet grown so ripe. Why? Because we can assume that those being sold come from the place where they ripen faster and are not Shemitah produce. The Mishnah continues, Rabbi hitir likach yarag motzei Sheviit miyad. Rabbi was extremely lenient, more lenient. He allowed someone to buy vegetables immediately after Shemitah and treat them as non-Shemitah produce, because the Rav explains in his first explanation, most of the vegetables sold in Eretz Yisrael were imported from outside the country, so a buyer can assume that he was buying produce that did not grow in Eretz Yisrael. The Chazon Ish explains, brought down by the Art School Elucidated, that Rabbi permitted this only after Shemitah and not on Shemitah itself, and they quote the Chazon Ish to see his explanation over there, why this is so. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Daled. Mishnah now discusses exporting certain items from Eretz Yisrael, including Shemitah produce. En motzi'in shemen tzrefa uperot Sheviit me'aretz lechutz la'aretz. We are not allowed to export oil of terumah that must be burned because it became tameh, or Shemitah produce from the land of Israel to outside of Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because the procedures that these stuff require, mainly the burning of terumah oil and the bi'ur of the Shemitah produce, they must be done in Eretz Yisrael. Now the Mishnah gave a case of oil only as an example, but we know that any terumah that became tameh, a kohen cannot eat. Rather, it has to be burned. So, using oil as an example, we call it shemen tzerefa, oil that must be burned. Now, the reason you have to burn in Eretz Yisrael is a rabbinic decree. The rabbis gave terumah the level of the similar sanctity level as kodashim, the temple offerings. Meaning, just like we know offerings that became disqualified have to be burned in the place where they would have been eaten if they would have been qualified, either in the temple courtyard or in Yerushalayim, the Chachamim decreed that terumah that is tameh must be also destroyed in Eretz Yisrael, since that is the proper place for eating terumah. How do we know the bi'ur of Shemitah produce has to be done in Eretz Yisrael? We learn it from a pasuk. It says, in your land has to be all your produce. The Chachamim learn out that the bi'ur of Shemitah produce must be done in Eretz Yisrael. So to prevent bi'ur from being done outside of Eretz Yisrael, the rabbis decreed that Shemitah produce cannot be taken out of Eretz Yisrael even before it becomes subject to the obligation of bi'ur. Now we know terumah that is ta'ol certainly cannot be taken out of Eretz Yisrael, because the Chachamim decreed that foreign lands have the status of tumah, they are tameh, and it is forbidden to cause terumah to become tameh. Therefore, you cannot take out pure tahol terumah. However, the Mishnah is being mechadesh, is teaching us that even terumah that is already tameh cannot be taken out of Eretz Yisrael because of the decree the rabbis gave, similar to the kodashim. Amar Rabbi Shimon said, Shamati beperush shemotzin leSuria. I explicitly heard that we can export these items from Eretz Yisrael to Syria, ve'en motzin lechutz la'aretz, but we cannot export them to other places outside of the land of Israel. The Mefarshim explain, Rabbi Shimon agrees that these procedures have to be done in Eretz Yisrael, but he holds that Syria is considered part of Eretz Yisrael, even according to the Torah. He disagrees with the Tana of Mishnah Bet that we spoke about earlier. Accordingly, he says, whatever must be done in Eretz Yisrael can be done in Syria. Therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, there is no reason to prohibit taking these items to Syria. But the Rav tells us, En halakha Rabbi Shimon, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Shimon, and therefore we cannot export these items outside of Eretz Yisrael to other places. That is then, Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.